Every sunset in the evening signifies that the new sunrise and a new beginning is going to happen. Good evening, everyone. With great joy and immense exultation, I extend my warm welcome to all dignitaries, guests, and delegates present here for the webinar series organized by Diksha e-Learning in association with Ayurveda College Coimbatore. In today's session, we will be discussing about basics of blood investigations and its importance by Dr. Rajmohan B.
Before starting the session, I would like to go through a few of the basic instructions to be followed throughout the session. Any questions can be raised in the chat box. Questions raised will be cleared at the end of the session. For the best stability, use a laptop and a high-speed internet connection. If your video is on, please make sure you are in front of a professional background. In case of any disruption, kindly check your internet connection and wait patiently for the class to resume. Please make sure your microphone is on mute to have a disturbance-free session. Make sure you have your full name displayed so that it is professional. Thank you.
Next, I would like to invite Dr. C. Vaishnav, Assistant Professor, Department of Roganidhanam, Ayurveda College, Coimbatore, to deliver the welcome address.
Good evening, one and all. I heartily welcome you all for today's webinar. As you all know, today's session is on the topic Basics of Blood Investigation and its Importance by Dr. Rajmohan V, Assistant Professor, Department of Rasashastra and Vaishyakalpana, Government Ayurveda College, Kannur, Kerala. I extend a warm word of welcome to you, sir, for accepting our invitation and for being with us here today. Hope your valuable experience will be enlightening to all of us. On behalf of Ayurveda College Coimbatore, I welcome you all delegates for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Before starting the session, let me give a brief introduction about today's guest speaker, Dr. Rajmohan V. Dr. Rajmohan V has completed his BAMS and MD in Ayu from Government Ayurveda College, Thiruvananthapuram, under the University of Kerala. He was a medical officer in the Department of Indian System of Medicine and research officer in the Drug Standardization Unit under the Directorate of Ayurveda Medical Education, Government of Kerala. His teaching career started at Vaidyaratnam P.S. Warrior Ayurveda College, Kottakkal, and later continued to Government Ayurveda College, Thiruvananthapuram, and further to the current institution. Presently, he is the technical committee member of the School of Ayurveda as well as the School of Health Policy and Planning of the Kerala University of Health Sciences. We are very joyful and cheerful on your presence among us today. Now, without any further ado, let's hand over the session to Dr. Rajmohan V. Over to you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening, one and all respected teachers and all the delegates and all students. Warm good evening to all of you. I shall now share my screen. Hope my screen is visible and I am audible.
Yes, sir. It's visible.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Don't feel that I'm just deviating from the subject, but a couple of slides I have adopted from another presentation, which is very important. While we are prescribing any diagnostic tools, we need to understand some of the basics, some of the ethical aspects we have to keep in our mind while we are ordering a diagnostic imaging or any kinds of laboratory diagnostic test or diagnostic imaging. So these are the some of the basics. I would like to give you some of the basics first. From that, we will move to the basics of the laboratory investigations. The first thing is that any of the diagnostic techniques should be considered only to verify or reject a clinically based diagnostic hypothesis. This is a thumb rule. Actually, this is proposed by World Health Organization. World Health Organization's guideline for diagnostic imaging. This is actually applicable nowadays to the laboratory investigations also. Why? Because Majority of the laboratory investigations now are very specific and highly sensitive, and most of them are very costly also. So when we are considering a diagnostic imaging or laboratory test, we need to consider the clinically based diagnostic hypothesis. We almost always we must have a clinical hypothesis before we are ordering a diagnostic imaging or laboratory investigation. That is very important. So there is an order. So so many students are assembled here. For them, just a reminder of what you have learned in your BAMS class. Just think that when we are approaching a patient, we will take first, there will be a case taking. The case taking is having an order. As all you are aware, the case taking we are taking in an order. The first is the presenting complaint. The presenting complaint is nothing but the complaint that made the patient to come to the hospital. That is the first thing, or come to the clinic or come to the doctor. Okay, usually the symptom that is that made the patient to come to the hospital may not be the severe symptom. There must be other, may not be the severe condition. There may be some other conditions that actually hidden in that symptom. Usually patients approaches clinic. A patient approaches clinic only when there is a severity of symptoms. What is a severe symptom? A severe symptom is a symptom that is affecting the day-to-day life of the patient. So even though there may be a lump, a heaviness in one part of the body, and there is a one part of the abdomen, and there is a lump inside, the patient may not reach us. The patient will come to us only when that lump impinges on a nerve, and there is a pain radiating to the lower limb. Probably that will affect the day-to-day life of the patient. So that is the presenting complaint. That is known as the presenting complaint. The complaint that made the patient to reach our hospital or reach our clinic or reach to the doctor. That is the first thing we have to keep in mind. And the second thing is the history of the presenting complaint. How, when this happened actually. And the next thing is the history of past illness. That is very important. That history is very important in clinical medicine. Okay, because without a proper history, we cannot come to a proper diagnostic or a proper prognostic aspect for arriving at a decision on a proper diagnosis as well as for proper prognosis and for treatment. Definitely, the history of the presenting complaints as well as the past illness, both are very important. So that is the history of past illness. So when after we considering all those things, we will have certain idea in our mind. Okay, that is known as a some idea regarding an illness. Let me give you an example. If a patient coming to you with as we are talking about laboratory investigations, I will stick on to modern terminologies of disease. I'm not going to the Ayurvedic terminology of disease that we will discuss in the later of this session. Okay, a patient coming to you, a 13-year-old boy coming to you with a flitting joint pain. Flitting joint pain means at certain point of time the pain is on the elbow joint, and there is pain, severe pain is there, morning stiffness is there, and sore throat is there, fever is there, and later the pain has shifted to another joint, and then from there to another joint. So it is a flitting joint pain or shifting joint pain. It is usually a feature of as you know, it is rheumatic fever. Okay, so the thing is that in the initial stage, by looking into the patient might have arrived at our clinic with this a single joint pain, that is an elbow joint pain currently. But earlier he had pain on his knee joint, but of less severity. Okay, so the patient arrived because of this elbow joint, and we have dig much more into the symptoms, and he simply said that I had earlier, his father said earlier my child had these kinds of symptoms. So that is the importance of past illness. And now we have a provisional thinking that this is a polyarthritis affecting multiple joints. Okay, what would be the thing? Then we will start examining the patient. That is based on the history, based on the presenting complaints, based on the history of past illness and all, we will start to examine the patient. Of course, there is thoroughly we need to examine individual joints, and the individual joint examination is there in some of the textbooks. It is there in the surgical textbooks. It is there in the clinical diagnostic textbooks and all. So you focus on the clinical examinations, and for a beginner, you have to do the entire body examine thoroughly. That is the thumb rule when for a beginner has to examine the patient thoroughly, irrespective of the condition, so that you will learn how to examine it. Initially, it will take around 45 minutes, 30 to 45 minutes to examine completely a patient, but later, while you practice, you will see that you will be able to examine a patient for 15 to 20 minutes, or sometimes when you become a highly specialized, highly experienced person, you could do a physical examination in 10 to 10 minutes. So if you are a very experienced and a good doctor, you have to spend time with the patient at least for 50 to 20 minutes, so that you will get a clear idea of his condition, and you could probably avoid unwanted diagnostic imaging and unwanted diagnostic laboratory tests. So definitely the provisional diagnosis, we will have a provisional diagnosis after the physical examination, after getting the presenting complaints, after getting the history of the presenting complaints, and not on the past illness, and while we go through the physical examination. And the physical examination, as you are well aware, that there should be inspection is there, palpation is there, percussion is there, auscultation is there. As you are well aware that if you are suspecting rheumatic fever, you have to the auscultation is having a definite role, because you know that it has some involvement with the valves of the heart. So all those cardiac affection is also there. So this is the order you have to follow for a thorough examination. And of course, we may elaborate on each one of these, and this is the general stuff. You may elaborate on each of these points, and you will come to. And with this point, at this point, you will get a provisional diagnosis. The child is having a polyarthritis with afflicting joint pain, and I prefer to verify my my provisional diagnosis and with some of the blood test, and you will go for some ASO titer, ESR, etc., and a complete blood count you may take. So why? You have a clinically based diagnostic hypothesis, as you want to test it against which one is correct. And after the laboratory investigations and after the diagnostic imaging, probably you will get you will be your septic, it could be septic arthritis, or it could be rheumatic fever. You will come to one or two conditions, that is known as differential diagnosis. And again, you go through all these conditions, and you ask some of the questions again, and you verify the family history again, and you verify from where the patient is coming, and all those things. And based on all those things, you will rule out each and one condition, then you rule out the other one, and finally you arrive at a particular diagnosis. This is known as diagnosis. So from the presenting complaints to arrive at diagnosis, in between, you have to do some of the diagnostic techniques, which may be imaging or which may be laboratory tests. Laboratory tests are much more cheaper, sometimes which are very efficient. By looking into some of the blood pictures, the biochemical parameters of the blood, serological parameters, we may arrive at a beautiful diagnostic kill. So how much we have spent time with the patient, how much we have knowledge about the physical conditions, psychological conditions, and the disease status of the patient, we may use a smaller and very specific laboratory diagnosis. Dear students, when you look into when you evaluate which is the mostly written, mostly ordered laboratory investigations, probably you will see that it is the blood investigation on glucose, okay, diabetes, or the hyperglycemia. Usually we all, and the lipid profile, usually we check. Why? Because we know the normal values, and we exactly know where to test these things. We usually don't order for a complete blood count, or we usually don't order for an anti-nuclear antibody. We usually don't order for some other blood test, because we don't know exactly where to use it or where to find this one is very useful, and in which clinical conditions or which clinical setting we have to use this particular blood test. So in order to order a laboratory diagnosis, or in order to understand a laboratory diagnosis, we exactly know for what purpose we are doing that laboratory diagnosis. For in order to order a laboratory diagnosis, you not only not only you must have a thorough idea regarding the laboratory diagnosis, its indications, and where to use it on all those steps. Apart from that, you also need to have a very clear-cut idea regarding the pathology of the disease you are considering. So unless and until you don't have a clear idea of the pathology of the disease, the laboratory investigations you are actually conducting is meaningless, and you will not be able to arrive at a proper differential diagnosis. So my dear students, I would suggest you, if you are ordering a laboratory test, there must be a clear idea regarding for what purpose exactly, for what provisional diagnosis you have in your mind, or what differential diagnosis you have in your mind you are going to refute, or you are going to accept, what kind of diagnostic hypothesis. So this is the thumb rule, and you must follow this thumb rule. Otherwise, what will happen, you will test a lot, you will order a lot of tests to the patient, and you will order even an MRI to the patient, and that may not be useful. After that, you find that you could not find anything in that MRI, or you could not find anything in that blood test, and probably you may refer the patient, and after the patient will go to some specialist, and they will order the specific test, and they will find out the condition. The problem here is that you think about the patient has lost some of the valuable time, and the patient also has lost some of the valuable money he is having. So please avoid writing laboratory investigations without any provisional diagnosis in your mind. It is very, very important. That is the thumb rule one. So this is another thumb rule. Any diagnostic efforts are justified only when followed by appropriate therapeutic measurements. This is also very important. Any diagnostic efforts, if you are attempting to a patient is coming to you, the patient is having certain delirium, the patient had a fall, the patient is, you are suspecting a head injury, and you actually want to, you are ordering a MRI head, or a CT of the patient, a head and neck of the patient, a head and neck CT of the patient. Actually, you are not a specialist who can actually manage this head injury. Then what actually you are doing is you are wasting the time. Okay, so if you have a plan, you are thinking that when I am doing this laboratory test, when I am doing this diagnostic imaging, I will end up in 3 or 4 differential diagnoses, out of which 3, if the first, second, and third differential diagnosis is there, probably I can manage this patient. Of course, if that is the case, you have to order a diagnostic test. Otherwise, the ordering a diagnostic test is the right of the patient, who is exactly managing, exactly treating the patient. So even if you are ordering a just take that example, a patient coming with a head injury, and there is signs of head injury and symptoms of head injury are there, you are ordering an MRI, and you find out that, or a CT, you find out that there is a oozing out of blood from the middle meningeal artery. Then you are referring it. Please don't do that. If you are suspecting that hemorrhage, you refer the patient as early as possible to a center, so that valuable time and valuable money is saved. This is true in case of laboratory diagnosis also. That's why it is clearly clearly mentioned here. Any diagnostic efforts are justified only when followed by appropriate therapeutic measurements. This is again the thumb rule. So the general considerations here are the clinical problems. You evaluate the clinical problems of the patient, and you evaluate the clinical findings. What are the clinical findings are having, and what are the clinical considerations and costs? These are the things you have to keep in mind. The clinical problems, what are the signs and symptoms and history telling you about the patient, and what are the clinical findings you are having, of course, and what are the clinical considerations you are doing. And of course the cost, always consider the cost when you are prescribing a laboratory investigations. You think through while prescribing this particular laboratory investigations, I will be able to treat the patient in time, so that the cost of this laboratory investigation is somewhat justified. And after the laboratory investigations come positive, you are telling the patient that I don't have a treatment for this particular condition. You need to go to some other centers and you treat there, because it probably that will end up in a dual testing, because in Kerala nowadays majority of the laboratory test will be done in the hospital itself. They won't accept test done outside the hospital or some outside laboratory. Usually they will start testing again. They will repeat the test, particularly if it is a cancer marker, particularly if it is some of the hormone panel, some of the hepatic panels. They usually don't take test done outside the hospitals, because they don't rely on that. Okay, some issues already arised in Thiruvananthapuram regarding this. So this is the major considerations you have to make. Okay, decision making, diagnosis, treatment, and prognosis. For what exactly we are using a laboratory test or a diagnostic tool? A diagnostic tool is, of course, we are using it for decision making, for a proper diagnosis or for a proper prognosis. Not always we are using it for a diagnostic purpose. Sometimes a patient with an end stage disease, probably we do a laboratory test, or probably we do a diagnostic imaging for a clear-cut idea regarding the prognosis of the disease. So a decision making whether to treat or not, that is also very important. Sometimes this particular condition is treatable by me usually, but if it is above a particular stage, I may not be able to treat the condition. So that decision making is also, it is different from the condition just I have mentioned earlier. So for the decision making also, we have to use the laboratory test. For a proper diagnosis, we have to use the diagnosis. For identifying the stage of the disease and selecting appropriate treatment. Of course, when you are doing a Swedana Karma, when we are doing some Swedana Karma, exactly we have to probably know what is the high glycemic status of the patient, and also what is the status of the lipid profile of the patient, all those things, because we should not do a Swedana Karma or if the patient is a diabetic person, because it may increase his diabetic condition. It may not be suitable for him, and that will end up in some of the deleterious stage of the disease. So of course, for a proper prediction of the prognosis also, we have to use the laboratory investigations. This is the order of giving a proper diagnostic tool. You take a patient history that I already explained what is a patient history. It comprising of the presenting complaints and the history of the presenting complaint, history of past illness, and all those things. And clinical examination is a very important thing. And then we will go for investigations. Investigations can be laboratory investigations and imaging. This must be the order. And I request each and every students assembled here to interrogate your patient, observe your patient thoroughly and effectively, so that you will arrive at a clear-cut idea regarding the condition of the patient, the disease condition of the patient, or the health status of the patient. That is very necessary. For that you need an elaborate reading. Without the support from the textbooks, without the support from the clinical experience, and without the support from the help of your teachers, your seniors, you will not be able to emerge as a good doctor. A good doctor always observes. A good doctor always listens. Listening is the best quality of a doctor. Observation is the best quality of a doctor. So observe your patient, listen to your patient, and take your own time. At least at the beginning of your 5 to 6 years, you observe your patients thoroughly and take the case patiently and effectively. Each and every part of the examination, physical examination, you follow the thumb rules, you follow your textbooks, you follow the experienced persons, and you follow your masters and follow your teachers. So the clinical examination and patient history part are very important. So this must be the order of doing all those things. So I will escape from this presentation and will move to the basics of the blood investigations. So this is the thumb rule of investigating, thumb rule of any investigations you are actually using in clinical setting. I will share the next presentation. Hope I am audible.
Yes, sir. You're
Okay.
audible, sir.
Okay. Before going to the blood investigations, because blood investigation is a very vast area, I don't think that I cannot complete at least ESR, or at least what should I say, at least one or a couple of blood investigations today, because it is very vast, because we need to discuss a lot of things, fundamentals before we are moving deep into the blood investigations. Otherwise, it is not possible for you to follow it. That is the thing. So this is when we are in a clinic or when we are in a hospital, the first thing we have to do is to assess the severity of illness of a patient. This severity, illness severity, assessing the severity of illness is very important in clinical medicine or in any clinical situations. So I will show you a standard early warning score system here. This is very important. You may hope you are all observing this one, or hope you are all you could all students can see this. This is on a standard early warning system. The utility of this system is very important, because when you are in a night duty at your hospital and you are in charge of the hospital, usually when currently I have joined Government Ayurveda College and transferred and posted as associate professor at Government Ayurveda College Thiruvananthapuram. So I'm in my alma mater. I just joined back to my college. And while there is it's as you are aware, it's a very huge hospital with 500 or more patients admitted at a single point of time. And when we are in night duty, it's always there is night calls we need to attend, and some patients will be in a much more severe conditions. Probably there will be cardiac conditions, some renal conditions, and some neurological conditions. And it is, of course, it is a government hospital. Most probably there will not be any bystander. So when we attend the patient, we have to instantaneously assess the severity of illness of that patient, so that we have to take a decision whether the patient has to be kept in our hospital or whether the patient has to be referred to a higher center. So that is the decision we need to make urgently. For that, usually I personally use this particular algorithm. This is on a standardized early warning system. It's otherwise known as SIEVE score. It is known as SIEVE, standardized early warning system. There is the parameter you can see in the left-hand side. Respiratory rate, oxygen saturation, temperature, systolic blood pressure, heart rate, AVPU response. These are the major parameters. And why these parameters? Just think about this. Probably, even though there is thousands of diseases in the world as identified, over thousands and thousands of diseases. Now we have added another disease to that, COVID, coronavirus disease. The cause of death is only 3, or the pathology of death. When we look into that, we probably could die only in 3 ways. The first one is the asphyxial death, so that our respiratory system is affected, and the second one is the syncopical death, in which the cardiovascular system is affected, and the third one is the neurological death or comatose death. It is known as the comatose death. So the death is of 3 types. The first one is asphyxial death, in which the respiratory system is affected, and the second one is the cardiovascular death, which is known as the syncopical death, and the third one is the comatose death, in which the central nervous system is affected and the brain is affected. These are the 3 mode of death, or 3 types of death is classified. Of course, so whatever may be the severity of the condition, before death, the patient will arrive at any of these three modes, either in the asphyxial stage or in the syncopical stage or in the comatose stage. So if we will be able to identify this particular condition very earlier, we may support his life by giving a high dependency unit or a life support measures. We may provide some life support measures, and we will support his life. So I suggest everyone to write down this, or take a screen capture of this guideline and try to use it. When you use it regularly, you will be able to practice, and you will be able to keep it in your mind, so that you will assess a patient very easily. So the most important system we need to keep in our mind is always respiratory system, because the oxygen is necessary for the proper functioning of the cardiac muscles, and as well as for the brain. So a person with asphyxia, the person with breathing difficulty is always considered first. Probably you might heard about the triage guidelines, TRIAGE. Just Google it out and just go through that. It is a very wide guideline. It is known as triage guidelines. You may probably see, you observe these triage halls at all major hospitals with an emergency care facility, in which the patients from different parts of the different places will with this, varying severity will will keep in this triage hall, and they will, depending upon the severity, they will provide ventilators, etc., etc. So for a proper clinical setting, identification of a proper clinical choice, these triage guidelines are very much important. I think the power has lost here. I am in Wi-Fi. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yeah. Because there is a power failure here. Let me continue. Okay. So so these are the parameters we need to consider. The first one is the respiratory rate. Second one is the oxygen saturation. Third one is the temperature. Fourth one is the systolic blood pressure. Always keep in mind that the systolic blood pressure is so important. And the heart rate, ABPU response, that is that I will come. What is ABPU response? So in which respiratory rate and oxygen saturation will check the respiratory system. Systolic blood pressure and heart rate will check the status of the cardiovascular system, and ABPU response will definitely check the status of the the nervous system. I will just show you that. Okay, so these are the scoring here. You could see the scorings here. These are the scoring system. You could see that the central part is 0, and 1, 2, 3 are there in the 1, 2, 3 are there in the left side and also in the right side. And if a person is with pneumonia, if a person is with pneumonia, I will just explain a case. Once I was in my night duty, and there was a call from the cardiac ward, because a patient was a patient is having some delirium or something like that. He is very agitated, in an agitative mode. He is disoriented, very disoriented, and I just reached there, and he's in his bed, but he's some incoherent speech, non-coherent speech he's having. So everyone is complaining that the patient is already is a drunkard, and he might have consumed some alcohol or something like that. And so these kinds of allegations will be there from the ward, and we should not listen to all those things. Probably you have to listen to that, and never taken it for granted on the first thing itself. Okay, so the advantage of this scoring system is that there was no bystander available with that patient. Okay, that is the major issue. So we may not be able to get what actually happened from the clinical situation, right from that situation. So we have started examining the patient, and the first one, the respiratory rate, you can see the respiratory rate of the patient was very elevated. The respiratory rate of the patient was over 21, and it was nearing about 28 or something like that. And the oxygen saturation of the patient was 86. So the respiratory rate was around 28, and the oxygen saturation was 86. And the temperature, the body temperature was slightly over the normal, around 38 or something like that. There was a body temperature. This body temperature, the significance of this body temperature is that will give you the there is a fever. That means the infection, inflammation, infestation, collection, all those things will give you a fever. So the temperature is also very important. So the temperature was this oxygen saturation was 86, and the temperature was at this range. And systolic blood pressure was no problem. The blood pressure was normal. Systolic blood pressure was between 100 to 190. 99, no problem. And the heartbeat was, of course, it was slightly on the normal side, this one. And AVPU response means A stands for alert, V stands for verbal, and P stands for pain, and U stands for unresponsive. This is AVPU response. This will give you you might be heard about Glasgow's coma scale. And this Glasgow's coma scale, there is a 15 point, and it will assess the autonomic system, sensory system, and verbal system, motor system, and all. But here this AVPU response will give you a quick idea regarding the status of the brain of the patient. A stands for alert. The patient, of course, the patient was alert, but he's having some delirium. That is not an issue. He was very alert. So again, that is not an issue. Verbal only. Verbal means if we call his name loudly to his ear, then only he will respond. Ramakrishnan, then he will just a slight response he will give. Pain means you give some pain on the supraorbital, you press over the supra here, or you here you give a press or a pinch over the biceps or a pinch over the triceps. Deep muscle pain deep pain will give you a response. That is known as pain only response. Unresponsive means the patient is not responding to any kind of stimuli, because this is a very severe condition. That means it is 3. So the patient was alert. So when you calculate the score, here it is 1, and here it is 2, and here it is again 1. That is 3 and 4. When you look into the SIEVE score, it is 4. Mandate immediate involvement of the nurse in charge and medical assessment within 20 minutes. That means the patient is having certain conditions that needs urgent attention. If the SIEVE score is SIEVE score is below 4, nothing to worry. You need between 2 and 4. There is nothing to worry. You need repeated observation of the below 2. Nothing to worry. Routine observations are fine. Between 2 and 4, you need repeated observations of the patient, and between 4 and 6, very, very careful observations of the patient. And if above 6, that means the patient is really in danger, and you need to refer the patient to a higher center with adequate facility. So this is the guideline, and you may use this thing. And there is a case example is also there. The patient has respiratory rate. You think about another patient with a respiratory rate of more than 36, and oxygen saturation below 85. And temperature, again, this much of systolic blood pressure is lowered 80 to 99, and heartbeats are of course lower 40 to 49, and AVP response is alert. In this case, in a total, you will get a SEEV score, that standard early warning score of 7. That means the patient is in danger. You need to refer to the patient. The advantage of this thing is that we don't need to talk to the patient. We simply examine the patient, and depending upon the SEEV score, you take a clinical decision. So that is very important, whether to keep the patient with you or to refer to a higher center with much more facilities. For that, you have to use this SEEV score. You may even take a printout of this, and you may attach to your hospital casualty or hospital night duty room or hospital severity assessment, wherever the patient bedside, so that you will be able to assess this with a thing. So please look into this thing. Okay, here the 1, 2, 3 is there, here also. And this particular patient I have mentioned was actually having a pneumonia, a severe pneumonia. The severe pneumonia means there is breathing difficulty, there is poor gas exchange happening in the lungs, or because of this all exudates coming from the alveoli. That is preventing the gaseous exchange. That means when there is reduced gaseous exchange, there will be hypercapnia. That will increase the respiratory rate. That's why there is an increased respiratory rate of more than 20. And it is corroborated that the oxygen saturation is also going low. That is 86. If it is below 92, always oxygen therapy is giving, because the oxygen level has lowered. The oxygen to the brain is lowered. That's why the patient is having some sort of delirium-like behavior. And there is a temperature. This temperature is telling that clearly telling that there is an increased respiratory rate, reduced oxygen saturation, and there is a temperature, means some infectious conditions of the lung causing these features. It is usually pneumonia, and you have to, the first choice is pneumonia. Of course, I will give you another condition. A patient was having a heart rate of 141. A patient was having a heart rate of 141 and a systolic blood pressure of 200. Now itself it is 5. And this was again this was a case of cardiac arrhythmia and all. So these kinds of cases will come to you, and I request every students to look into these parameters. Usually we take heart rate, and if you find that the heart rate is elevated between 100 and 109, we don't look into other parameters. Of course, it is very important that all these parameters are particularly taken care of while you are examining a severely ill patient. Don't forget. Sometimes we usually look into systolic blood pressure, we usually look into heart rate, but the thing that we usually avoid is this respiratory rate. Please do not forget to take the respiratory rate. Though we don't have a this thing, this is, you know, that it is a pulse oximeter. A pulse oximeter is a very important device. You have to keep you may get it from 1,500 to 2,000. This one you may get online, and this is a much more costly. In your hospitals, probably you may buy this one, in which you may connect the BP apparatus and all those things. You can. It's a so at least a portable oxygen is very necessary. Pulse oximeter is very necessary. Particularly, you are living in a post-COVID era. You know that the lungs are, because the lungs having largest number of AC2 receptors, the viral entry in this SARS-CoV-2 is happening through lungs. So probably lungs are affected, pneumonia is happening, and acute respiratory distress is there. ARDS, the acute respiratory distress syndrome, is there, and again ARDS is there, and again pneumonia is there, and acute lung injury is there. So all those things is affecting the lungs. So These is very important. So please keep this in mind. I will take a couple of questions regarding this because that will also give you a breathing time regarding this severity early warning score. Is it okay? If anybody is having any doubt regarding this, probably we will clear it and move. Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir. I think there's no doubt for the participants, so we can move on to the next topic.
Okay. So please keep this in mind. Score 0 to 1, routine observations. Score 2 to 3, hourly observations. And score 4 to 5, alert. And score more than 6, immediate intensive care. So please utilize this scale. Next, we will move to some of the basic aspects of blood investigations. Each of these things, probably the first year and second year students might be aware of all those things pretty well. But unfortunately, we never go to the basics in between. While we are practicing medicine, while we are practicing these laboratory investigations, it is definitely we need to brush up the basics in between, so that we are always trying to interpret based on the anatomy or based on the physiology. So in between, you have to go back and you have to learn. You have to just make it clear what are the basics and all those things. You can see that the functions of the blood, that transport of oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, hormones, heat, and waste, regulates pH, body temperature, and water content of cells. It's very important. Protect against blood loss through clotting, and against diseases through phagocytosis, and white blood cells and proteins such as antibodies, interferons, and complement. These are the functions of blood, and I think I have taken this from the Tortora. Tortora is a very simple and effective textbook with beautiful pictures. That is the important. You may take it as a reference text. Okay. So transport of oxygen is through blood. So you can measure the status of oxygen. Arterial blood gas analysis is there. It is so the how much amount of oxygen is there in the blood. You probably, that is, we have just see, you can use a pulse oximeter, and again arterial blood gas analysis is there. So oxygen, carbon dioxide, and again the status of nitrogen. Again you can look into it. So by looking into the functions of the blood itself, there will be lot of blood tests we can see. And what are the nutrients? There are a lot of nutrients in the blood. Vitamins are there, minerals are there. So we could look into the calcium status, we could look into the vitamin B status, vitamin C status, A status. So there the transport of nutrients. So blood is a by some of the vitamin deficiency diseases, all those things we can look into the nutrients. And of course hormones. There are the differences between, there is no enzymes mentioned here. What are the difference between hormones and enzymes? Hormones are produced in the glands, and it is transported through the blood, and it is taken by specific receptors situated in specific cells. But while enzymes are produced in glands, but it is transported to its site of action through a duct. So this is the difference between hormones and enzymes. Enzymes are not usually carried away in the blood. Okay, but hormones are instead carried through the blood to the site of action. So there will be a normal limit of hormones in the blood, but enzymes are usually not present in the blood. Though a little bit of enzymes, definitely some small values are there, because every organ, let us take about SGOT and SGPT. Okay, because liver producing these enzymes, and while there is liver cell damage, usually these enzymes will be present in the blood. Why there is a normal enzyme limit? Because when the liver cells are dividing, some of the liver cells are damaged. From that, this enzyme will reach the blood. So though there is a small amount of enzymes present in the blood, usually enzymes are not meant to transport through. But hormones, while we look into the hormones are always transported via blood. So there will be a normal limit of hormones in the blood, and there will be an upper limit. For enzymes, there will be a small limit, but increasing levels of enzymes means the targeted organ is damaged. If there is an elevated SGOT, alkaline phosphatase level, or SGPT level, whatever it is, that means the targeted organ is damaged. That is very important. If pancreatic lipase is elevated, that means the pancreas is damaged. So that is the important thing. Hormones means just look into the thyroid hormone. Thyroid is stimulating hormone. That means that will stimulate the production of thyroid hormones. If TSH is elevated, that means the function of the thyroid has been lowered. If TSH is elevated, means the functions of the thyroid has been lowered, and the TSH is trying, TSH, the communicating to the thyroid that you arise, you produce as much you produce, because your production is very lower. If the TSH level is below normal, that means there is a hyperactivity of the thyroid. And of course, it is the transportation of heat is through the blood, and waste, urea, uric acid, etc., creatine, etc., these are waste of protein byproducts. So that is also transporting through. So you can simply check these, what is the level of urea, what is the level of creatinine. If the urea is not taken properly filtered, or the urea is not properly eliminated, that means there is some problem with the functions of the kidney. So the disposal of the waste is also the function of the blood. So each of these signifies some blood test. This signifies the renal function test, hormonal test, etc. And regulate pH. pH regulation, as you know, that metabolic acidosis is there, metabolic alkalosis is there, respiratory acidosis is there, respiratory alkalosis is there. The level of carbon dioxide and level of oxygen determines the pH, and some of the bicarbonates, and of course the alkaline and acidic status of the blood. So the pH level is a bicarbonate, and the ionic status of the blood, calcium ion status, potassium ion status, sodium ion status, etc., all those things. So that is also important. So the pH status of the blood, and body temperature. It regulates the body temperature, and water content of the cells, because the osmolality, it's very, very, very important, osmolality of the thing. And it protects against blood loss through clotting. So the clotting factors, hepatic panel, when you look into the hepatic panel, there will be clotting factors, will be the clotting time, bleeding time, all those things will be there. And the factors responsible for blood clotting also we can check. And the status of the white bloods, the differential count, and the proteins such as antibodies, interferons, and complement proteins, all those things are there in the blood, which are specifically doing certain specific functions. And when these specific functions are lost, there will be certain diseases, and those diseases we have to check the status of these blood components. And this is the basic thing. The plasma is 55%, and the red blood cells are 45%. And this Buffy coat, which we are getting here, is the composed of white blood cells. And this test is known as, you are all aware, you simply take the blood and you centrifuge it tightly, and it will be divided into the plasma 55% and red blood cells 45%. And this is known as HCT. Okay. This is the component of blood which are very important. Whole blood is 8% of the body, other fluids and tissues are 92%, in which plasma is 55%, protein 7%, water 91.5%, other solutes 1.5%, albumins 54%, globulins 38%, fibrinogen 7%. And this is the constitution of the proteins, very important. These proteins, electrolytes, nutrients, gases, regulatory substances, waste products. So this is the plasma and formed elements. Blood is classified into 8% of the blood, and again it is classified into plasma, and formed elements. Formed elements are 45%, in which the platelets are, as you are aware, 1.5 lakhs to 4 lakhs. White blood cells are there 5,000 to 10,000. Red blood cells are 4.8 to 5.4 million. And neutrophil 60 to 70%, lymphocyte 20 to 25%, monocyte 3 to 8%, eosinophil 2 to 5. All these things you just to brush up the basics. This thing is very important. It is classified into two. Myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. Pluripotent stem cell. The blood is formed from a pluripotent stem cell. Pluripotent means it is capable to differentiate into any kind of cells. And blood is developed from a pluripotent stem cell. This pluripotent stem cell is divided into myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. And myeloid stem cells, myeloid stem cells, CFU means colony forming units. Colony forming units. CFU E means colony forming unit erythrocyte. CFU mega means megakaryocytes, karyoblast, and CFU colony forming unit macrocytes. So myeloid stem cells and lymphoid stem cells. This pro-erythroblast and reticulocytes and red blood cells. This is very important because while you are looking into the blood, the reticulocyte count is very important. Why? Because if there is loss of blood, if there is more loss of blood, if there is loss of red blood cells, the reticulocyte count will be elevated. Because why? Because it will take at least 120 days for this erythrocyte to form. So if there is loss of blood, what will happen? There will be the body will try to increase the production of red blood cells, and there will be the progenitor cells will be more in the blood than the matured red blood cells. There will be progenitor cells will be more in the so the reticulocyte count means that is more. That means so likewise each of these cells is having certain importance, that is called pro-erythro. If the erythroblast, the progenitor cells are more in the blood with an elevated count, that sometimes that indicates a malignancy. If the when we look into the blood picture, rather than differentiated cells, more undifferentiated and precursor cells are present in the blood. Usually, it is an indication of this probably malignancy and all. And based on the staining properties, we have acid staining cells, that is eosinophils, and basic staining cell, that is basophils, and neutrally stained cells, that is neutrophil. That's why the name is like that. And the monoblasts are there. Monoblasts are converted into macrophages. It is very important for scavenging microorganisms. And lymphoid stem cells, that is T lymphoblast and B lymphoblast, and natural killer cells. The role of these natural killer cells the role of these natural killer cells in killing viruses and separating its viral particles so that body can detect these viral particles and forms antibody against that, is well known to all of us. So these are the major components of blood. When we look into the differential count, if eosinophil count is elevated, that indicates certain issues. If basophil count is indicated, that indicates certain issues. Neutrophils are elevated, it indicates some certain issues. So these basics of blood is must be there in your mind to actually to predict the diseases that is arising in the diseases that is happening, and the pathology of the disease is very important. Pathology of the diseases are very important to understand. Okay, this is the blood picture. White blood cells, leukocyte, neutrophil, everything is there. Okay, these are the some of the functions. This is the basics. Water is 91.5%. It is the liquid portion of the blood. So let us talk about the functions of water. It is a solvent and suspending medium, absorbs, transports, and release heat. That is the importance of water. So the first blood test we usually learn and we usually do is the hematocrit or the packed cell volume, PCV. Just think about that. The PCV means, I will just go back and I will show you the PCV. This one is the PCV. The plasma is 55%. This is largely, this plasma is 55%. This is largely, mainly it is water. And this is the red blood cells. So this is the packed cell volume, where if we centrifuge the blood, there should be 55% of this water will be there. You just imagine a person is having severe dehydration, then what will happen? The water level in the plasma will be lowered. Okay, so what will happen? The plasma percentage will be lowered and the red blood cell count will be elevated. Okay, so the packed cell volume means we always 45% means it is the red blood cell, the packed cell. So from 45%, the PCV will be elevated. So an elevated PCV is an indication of the basic indication of dehydration. So you think about all those conditions that will causing dehydration. Okay, in diarrhea, there will be elevated PCV. And in any kind of dehydration, there will be elevated PCV. In some sort of diabetes, probably there will be, because when there is more loss of water from the body, there will be elevated PCV. So it is very important. This is the first diagnosis we usually mention. Okay, and so the water is the liquid portion of the blood. So that is solvent, and if there is loss of water, we will get it in the PCV level. Okay, plasma proteins, again, most produced by liver, responsible for colloid osmotic pressure. That is the plasma, the accurate level of plasma proteins are necessary for maintaining the osmotic pressure of the blood. What is and the transport of hormones, major contributors to blood viscosity and transport of hormones, that is fatty calcium, help regulate blood pH. This is the functions of the plasma proteins. So that's why we are checking the albumin globulin ratio, etc., etc. So if the plasma protein level, the plasma protein level is altered, what will happen? Usually there will be some symptoms. The major symptom you could find is the edema. There will be pedal edema, there will be periorbital edema, or some sort of edema in the body, that is fluid retention in the body. Why? Because the renal excretion of water may be affected. So the renal excretion of water, so there will be water retention in the body, that will present as edema. So that's why we generally look into in the renal function test, we usually look into the protein level also. So that is the importance of plasma proteins. So that's why we are looking at the plasma proteins. Why these plasma proteins? The function is the maintaining the osmotic pressure. If the plasma proteins are affected, the production is affected owing to some renal diseases, definitely some water retention or symptoms similar to that will happen. Albumin, smallest and most numerous plasma protein, maintaining again that osmotic pressure comes into play. Globulin comes into play. Viruses, it also helps to attack viruses and bacteria. Alpha and beta globulin transports iron, lipids, and fats also. See the globulin level, hemoglobin, it's a globulin, hemoglobin. It helps in the transportation of iron. So that's why if that hemoglobin is affected, there will be anemia. That's why we are checking for hemoglobin. And fibrinogen, if fibrinogen level is lowered, the problem is that it is essential role in blood clotting. So if a condition that is with a lowered blood clotting, we have to check into fibrinogen. If there is anemia, we have to check in globulin, hemoglobin. If some retention of, if some problem with the osmotic pressure and retention, we need to check albumin. And where these are produced, it may be some proteins are produced in the liver, some in the, and it is interfering with the functions of it is helping the functions of the kidney also. So these two systems we need to evaluate. And electrolytes again, these electrolytes are very important. It is sodium. Sodium is having an upper level, and also all the electrolytes are having an upper level and a lower level. Sodium is very important for our cellular functions. Chlorine is again important. Potassium is again, calcium is again. All these minerals, though they are necessary in very smaller quantities, very important. Carbonates, sulfates, and bicarbonates, all these phosphates, all these important electrolytes, all these are important electrolytes. They help to maintain osmotic pressure and play essential roles in cell functions. Don't forget that the essential roles in cell functions. Calcium is very essential for muscle contractions, and lowered calcium level may affect the cardiac function. Magnesium is also there. If there is if there is bone pain and very tired, feeling very tired, we usually look into calcium levels. And now it is low calcium levels and low vitamin D levels are very common, particularly in females, because we usually don't go out largely into sun nowadays. So the functions of nutrients, amino acids, glucose, fatty acids, glycerols, vitamins, and minerals are all nutrients are transporting through the blood. Their functions are growth and development. So if there is if the growth is affected, the development is affected, we usually have to look into the nutrients traveling through the blood. That's why we are checking the blood for some nutrients. If a person is become lean and lean, a 30 or 40-year person is become lean and lean every day. Why? Because there is no proper metabolism of the glucose is happening. That's why he is diabetic, and it is eliminated through the urine. It is not properly metabolized in the body. So that is the glucose. So if some deficiency diseases are there, we will usually look into vitamins. Vitamin A deficiency diseases, you are aware. It may affect the corneal epithelium. It may affect skin. So if some person is with a scaly skin and some affect eye issues, usually we will go to check the vitamins, probably vitamin A. And in certain countries, vitamin C can also cause skin conditions. Of course, the lipid levels we will definitely check. And in marasmus conditions and kwashiorkor, etc., we will check into the protein level of the blood. So many things. And oxygen level, carbon dioxide, all these things. Because why I'm showing all these things, because these are the things we usually look into a blood investigation, most of the laboratory investigations. Regulatory substances are enzymes. I already explained that enzymes are mainly not transported via blood, but their presence in the blood definitely tells us something regarding the disease condition. Of course, hormones regulate metabolism, growth, and development. Hormones, and the central nervous system actually acting through two systems. A nerve either will be attached to a muscle or it will be attached to a gland. That is the thing. A nerve will end either in a muscle or in a gland. That means if it is attached to a muscle, when it affects, the muscle will contract and there will be a motor activity. And if the nerve is attached to a gland, when it affects, the gland will be contracted and it will release a hormone or an enzyme that will act on a specific site or a specific nutrients or a specific compound. Like this is how the neuroendocrine system functions. The neuroendocrine system functions through glands and through skeletal muscles. And of course, vitamins, cofactors of enzymes reactions, and waste products, again, urea, uric acid, creatinine, bilirubin, etc. Most are breakdown products of proteins metabolism that are carried by blood to organs of excretion. You just think about bilirubin. If there are elevated levels of bilirubin, probably the bilirubin is collected in the gallbladder, and it is transported through the duct, and it is excreted into the duodenum. If some block is there, you know that there will be jaundice. It is known as obstructive jaundice. There will be elevated levels of bilirubin in the blood. That means the waste product is elevated in the blood, and it is deposited in the skin, etc., and the skin will turn into yellow color. So when you see these symptoms, you identify that the bilirubin, there is some issue with the waste product, that is the bilirubin, that is causing the symptom jaundice, and usually you check the yellow color producing bilirubin, and that's why you are testing bilirubin for jaundice, and the creatinine for kidney disorders and uric acid, etc., because all these waste products are associated with the proper functioning of the kidney, and of course for protein metabolism also. The basic test usually we conduct is a hemogram. This is a hemogram. The test usually conducted in hemogram is the first one is WBC, RBC, HB, HCT or packed cell volume, MCV, mean corpuscular volume, MCH, MCHC, RDW, MPV. I will come to each one of these. These are the tests usually conducted in a hemogram. If you order a hemogram, these are the tests you usually conduct. Okay. Complete blood count. Just this is when you order a CBC. These are the test you will usually get. The first one is a white blood cell count, that is WBC, leukocyte fight infection. So when there is an infection, usually the leukocyte count will be elevated, which is known as leukocytosis. Differential blood count, specific patterns of WBC. A differential blood count will exactly give you some ideas regarding which kind of organism is attacking the body. So for that, we will usually take a differential white blood cell count. It is lot of predictions are possible by looking into the differential blood pattern. A red blood cell count or RBC, that is very important. Red blood cell carry oxygen from lungs to blood tissues and carbon dioxide from tissues to lung. That is the function. And red blood cell count, it is the overall health of the blood is usually assessed through the red blood cell count. So that is very important, the RBC count. Hematocrit measures the RBC mass, or packed cell volume measures the RBC mass. It is the centrifuge I already explained. So that is how much RBC mass is there. Hemoglobin, that is HB, main component of RBC and transport O2 and CO2, oxygen and hemoglobin level. It is also the health of the blood. Usually we look into these three things give you the health of the blood. And red blood cell indices are also exactly give you the status of anemia. All these tests are necessary for assessing the exact type of anemia. Otherwise, hemoglobin will give you the lowered hemoglobin means there is a nutritional anemia, and again there iron deficiency anemia. All these things we may say that there is an anemia from lowered hemoglobin level. But you need to, in order to predict the exact nature of that anemia, you have to conduct all these things too. The red blood cell indices, this is known as red blood calculated value of size of HBC content and of RBC. And this is very important in anemia evaluations. Mean corpuscular volume. Mean corpuscular volume means the how much volume, how much size the RBC is having, and the size of the RBC. If the size of the RBC is small, if the size of the RBC is large, the anemia is microcytic anemia and macrocytic or microcytic. It is known as microcytic. In a nutritional anemia, usually microcytic hypochromic anemia. Hypochromic anemia means the lowered hemoglobin level will give you a lower color of the blood. So it is hypochromic. And microcytic, that means the erythroblast size is very small and the hemoglobin level is also small. That means it is a nutritional, mostly it will be a nutritional anemia. That nutrition also means iron also. Iron, the mineral iron deficiency also comes into nutritional level. So that is mean corpuscular volume and mean corpuscular hemoglobin concentration. That means the average hemoglobin present in the cell, that is MCHC, and mean corpuscular hemoglobin. How much hemoglobin is present in each of the RBCs and how much hemoglobin is present in a single RBC. That's the difference between both of things. And stained red cell examination, that is a blood film examination, peripheral blood smear examination, and platelet count often included in CBC. Platelet count usually in some laboratory will give you, when you order for a CBC, some laboratory will give you a platelet count and some not. Red blood cell distribution width, that is also important, how much the distribution width of the red blood cells. If the red blood cells are very small, that will be packed tight. Okay, so that is important. If the red blood cells are large, it is not that much packed effectively. Mean platelet volume, and these are the index of platelet production. Degree of variability and abnormal cell size are the RDW. So these are the major patterns we observe in complete blood count: white blood cell count, differential white blood cell count, RBC, HCT, HB, MCV, MCHC, MCH, peripheral blood smear, CBC, RDW, and MPV. These are the, when you order for a complete blood count, you will get all these things. So these are some of the clinical alerts. I think we are nearing the allotted time. So a packed cell volume or HCT of less than 20% can lead to cardiac failure and death. A very reduced HCT means cardiac failure and death. HCT of greater than 60% associated with spontaneous clotting of blood. That means the RBCs are very closer, the platelets are very closer, that may trigger a blood clot, spontaneous clotting of blood. So HCC 20% is a critical value. That means it may cause cardiac failure. And HCT of greater than 60% is associated with spontaneous clotting of blood. Hemoglobin value less than 5 leads to heart failure and death. So very careful. Hemoglobin value of 5 is very probably we might see persons having anemia, hemoglobin value of less than 5, but be very careful attending such patients. If you are very confident, usually it may lead to, depending upon certain conditions, it may even lead to heart failure. SB value greater than 20, such as in polycythemia vera, results in hemoconcentration and clogging of capillaries. So these are all critical values. These are all known as critical values. HCT 20%, 60%, and a critical decrease in platelet value less than 20 into 10 raised to 3 is associated with a tendency to spontaneous bleeding, prolonged bleeding time, petechiae, and ecchymosis, which usually we see in dengue fever, less than 20. So the 20 is a critical value, and they start FFP, fresh frozen platelets, usually plasma platelets, usually platelet will be transfused to the patients if it is critically lower than this 20 into less than platelets will be transfused. So the blood can be break down into several products. FFP is there, that is fresh frozen plasma. Again, we can take platelets, and whole blood we can give. So that is thing. So these are all critical values. So white blood cell count is there. I'm not going to such details. I think the time has already over. I will just give you another a small thing. searching for a slide. Yeah, we will stop here by explaining this slide. Usually neutrophils are elevated pyogenic infections of mostly bacterial nature. You know that the normal neutrophil count, if the neutrophil count is elevated, usually we cannot say that all the time, majority of the time it is pyogenic infections of bacterial origin. If in the differential blood count there will be elevated ESR, there will be elevated, probably there will be elevated white blood cell count. And if you look into the differential count, you may realize that the neutrophil count is elevated, and the complaint of the patient will be that is very uneasiness. Sometimes the patient will say bacterial infections, usually generalized bacterial infections are very severe. Probably active bacterial toxin in the blood is known as septicemia, and bacteria, circulating bacteria in the blood is known as bacteremia. Septicemia is a generalized condition and it is very severe, and it is associated with fever, sometimes hyperthermia, and if it is getting worse, there will be hypothermia instead of hyperthermia. So pyogenic infections of bacteria, if we are having an abscess, usually there will be a low grade fever. That indicates it is a bacterium, and if you look into the blood, probably you will see that there is an elevated neutrophil. Eosinophils, as we are all aware, there will be allergic disorders, and in parasitic infestations, eosinophil count will be elevated, will be above normal. And in basophils, again parasitic infections, some allergic disorders, there will be basophils will be elevated in again parasitic infections and some allergic disorders. Lymphocytes will be elevated in viral infections. Majority of the viral infections, lymphocytes will be elevated. Measles, rubella, chickenpox, infectious mononucleosis, of course in COVID also, there will be elevated lymphocytes. And monocytes will be there in severe infections. If there is a severe infections, usually monocytes also will be elevated apart from neutrophils. So neutrophils are elevated in pyogenic infections, eosinophils, allergic disorders, basophils, parasitic infections, lymphocytes, viral infections, and monocytes, severe infections. This is a general condition, and in a whole lot of conditions, all these things will be elevated. We cannot simply tell that this is the general thing, but in several conditions may cause. Simply look into the elevated leukocytosis means elevation of WBC. You can see that neutrophilic leukocytosis or neutrophilia, lymphocytic leukocytosis or lymphocytosis, all these things. So many conditions will cause these neutrophils. Leukemia, trauma, malignant neoplasm, toxins, drugs, hemolysis, hemorrhage, infections, lot of things. So I'm not going to the details. I think the time is already over. I'm sorry. I don't want to overshoot. So I don't want to cross the 8:30 mark. Okay, so I will stop here. Let us have a discussion, or I'm happy to take a couple of things. I request all the students assembled here to learn properly the basics of blood, and it actually we are predicting we are utilizing the laboratory investigations to refute or accept a clinical hypothesis. For that, you need to know the physiology and anatomy of the test you are using, the clinicopathological aspects. So for that, you need to learn the basics or the fundamentals of the blood and its components, the functions of its components, and the importance of its components. All these things you need to learn properly. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, sir. It was informative and great listening to you. I request all the participants to raise their questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand also and unmute yourself and ask, clear your doubts now. I also thank the participants who had attended this session. Please be sure to post your questions into the chat box. Yes, Dr. Surya Narayana, you can ask a question. Please unmute yourself, sir. Please, Dr. Surya Narayana Patnaik, you can unmute yourself and ask your question with sir.
Doctor, good evening.
Good evening, please, sir.
A 14 years boy, male patient having the 13,500 cells cubic millimeter TC.
Yeah.
It shows it is abnormal.
Yeah.
And his other parameters are this lymphocytes is 20% and a little bit of urine infection is there. But he is complaining fever at the time of 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. below.
4 p.m. to 6 p.m.
Yeah.
The count is 13,000, right?
13,500 cells.
Age.
14 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any other clinical presentation, sir? Because when we are about
earlier he was treated for the lymphadenopathy, mesenteric lymphadenopathy was there.
of course,
He was treated.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay. Most probably while we are predicting the laboratory investigations, a particular leukocyte count in a child, because a child is in a very active stage of development. So when there is an infection, the child's body will react extremely to the infections, and that is known as leukemia reactions. We may even doubt that this figure is something like that of a malignancy, because even the count may reach up to 20,000 or even more. So a 14,000 usually after an infection in a child, usually it may last for a pretty long time. It may be a remote increase in the white blood cell count rather than an indication. But the doubt is that there is a fever going on.
Yeah.
Okay, that is, and my preference is we need to check into some parasitic infestations. We have to doubt some parasitic infestations also.
Sure.
Yeah, that is. And what about the basophil or monocyte or that kind of counts?
This neutrophils is 70% and eosinophils 8%, monocytes 2%.
Eosinophils are also elevated. Okay.
Yeah.
Monocytes
2%.
Okay. TB is also we need to rule out.
Shall I go for Mantox again?
Yeah. You have already done Mantox?
I have not done. I will go for that.
Just take a chest X-ray if it is necessary. If there is cough or something like that, you specifically ask for cough, because the elevation of body temperature is also in the evening. Okay. So okay, and again that is very important. And the probably any signs of any meningeal irritation?
No. There is no stiffness of the neck and no that type of symptoms.
And most probably another suspicions are some collections. Some collections occurring in the body may also cause these kinds of symptoms. A collection can be a sinusitis. Okay.
There may be sinusitis, 5 to 10% symptoms are there.
Yeah. That also may cause the similar symptoms. Okay, sir.
Sir, shall I go with my treatment? This Dwara Chikitsa and dosha samadhata sthiti, dosha tridosha corruption.
Probably. I think that if this penisa is also there, we have to alter some treatment for that penisa condition also, because it may not go. That is very important. Okay. What was the cause of that lymphadenopathy, sir? You have
actually irregular dieting and maida excess taking.
Yeah, sir. That lymphadenopathy we need to explain properly, because then exactly I suggest you to go for this Mando also. Okay.
Sir, now shall I go with Kanchanara and other treatments?
Yes, sir. But because actually you are only seeing the patients, of the patient, right?
Yeah.
Kanchanara or any Gugulu preparations you can try, because in this particular condition, Gugulu preparations are a choice. But I suggest you to rule out TB and any other meningeal conditions, definitely.
Okay.
Because that evening rise of temperature is there that we need to,
Yeah.
and of
Yeah.
course some patterns are there. Okay, sir.
Yeah. Sure, I will go for further evaluations and then I follow that.
Okay, sir. Thank you.
Okay, doctor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Thank you, sir. Shall we move on to the next question, sir?
Yeah. I have another meeting in 5 minutes, so I am extremely sorry for that. And
Okay, sir.
anyway, we have five, a couple of minutes more. 5 minutes more, please.
Okay, so then can you name a good text to refer on lab tests, sir?
Actually, I usually refer. I have shown slides based on a foreign book.
Okay, sir.
I will just Sudhir sir. I will give the title to the Sudhir sir. Sudhir sir. I will take a photo of the title page and send to Sudhir sir. Otherwise, I tried many books, but this one I feel very, very useful and very, very effective, because it exactly give you what is the anatomy, physiology, and pathology, and you will be able to predict any disease conditions based on the information given in the textbook. It's a very elaborate and very vast textbook. It's the basics of hematology, that's the thing, but it's a very nice book. I will definitely give the title. The title page will give you exactly all the informations necessary for purchasing that book. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
And sir, what's the reason of too much higher B12 value in blood test and its treatment, sir?
Higher B12 value.
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, because I haven't come across that thing. Higher B12 value, because hypervitaminosis is there. Any hypervitaminosis conditions are there, but B12 is not a vitamin that usually cause higher vitaminosis, because vitamin C can cause. Vitamin A is the usual culprit, because some of the fish oils, health conscious people usually consume more fish oils. Fish oils are cold liver oils. Cold liver oils are usually coming from the liver of the salmon, etc. In salmon, in particular seasons, they will accumulate a lot of vitamin A. And if we, without proper guidance, if we take this cold liver oil preparations, or salmon is not available in our part of the country, in this part of the country, but that may cause hypervitaminosis. So vitamin A vitaminosis and C vitaminosis is very common, but vitamin B12 elevation, that need to be investigated, or I feel that I don't have that much idea regarding it. I'm sorry.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. I will definitely check that. Usually hypervitaminosis means we are consuming things that contains this vitamin. Okay. Still,
Okay,
whether there is any particular food pattern causing this, that we need to investigate. Okay.
Okay, sir.
Okay.
Can you move on to the next question, sir?
Yeah, please.
How can we interpret investigations like ESR and CRP level with relation to Amavasta, sir? How can we understand this laboratory parameters in the term of Ayurvedic concepts? Is it right to correlate like this, sir?
Yes, if you are very experienced person, if you are a very experienced, clinically experienced persons, definitely these laboratory investigations will aid in Ayurvedic diagnosis, and of course probably in your treatment also. Of course, definitely in some sort of condition, some sort of let us talk about fever itself. Fever means a temperature of 40 degrees centigrade, above 41 degrees centigrade. Above 41 degrees centigrade, we usually don't use the don't use the term fever. We use another term which is known as hyperpyrexia. Of course, hyperpyrexia is a different condition. I'm talking about fever. What is actually causing a fever? An inflammation is causing a fever. An infection is causing fever. Of course, an infestation may cause fever. A collection will cause fever. These are the four conditions that will end up in fever. The first one is the inflammation. All inflammatory conditions, whether it is autoimmune conditions, whatever it is. Of course, if you look into rheumatoid arthritis, when it is an autoimmune condition, there is an inflammation. Definitely the patient will have a fever, localized fever or a generalized fever, whatever it is. The next thing is the infection. Whether you are having a bacterial infection or a viral infection, definitely that is a fever. What is the difference between a bacterial infection, a fever originating from a bacterial infection and a fever originating from a viral infection? Both are different. In a bacterial infection, there will be a slight rise of temperature of probably 1 to 1.4 or 1.5 degrees centigrade, and that will last there. That is a constant fever. It's a continuing and constant fever. Fever will be there, and the patient will be very uneasy. The patient is having an uneasy, and he may even tell you that I afraid that I may get a fever. Actually, he's having a fever of a small rise of temperature. That is the usual pattern of bacterial fever. Largely spiking fevers usually occurring in viral conditions. Of course, when you look into COVID, or when you look into a viral fever or influenza of any kind, or a hepatic B, C, or jaundice, whatever it is, hepatitis A, you will get high fevers, 102, 103, 104. This is the feature of viral fevers. And in certain parasitic infestations like malaria parasite, you will get cyclic fevers, like in one thing. And one day you are having a fever, second day you don't have a fever, and third day again you are getting a fever. So likewise, in infections you are getting fever. So inflammations, that means the first one was inflammation, second was infection, third one is infestation. Infestation means parasitic infestations. In certain parasitic infestation, when the parasite is located in certain cavities, etc., etc., definitely it may create sometimes it may cause fever of unknown origin. We call it as fever of unknown origin. And if there is collections in the body, definitely there will be fever. Again, that will be a low grade fever. The patient will be very uneasy. I will give you an example. In hepatic hemorrhage, may cause hepatic hemorrhage will happen when there is a blunt trauma to the right of the abdomen. If you hit here like this, and or if you hit here like this, it is the place of the spleen, and it is the place of the liver. If there's a blunt trauma to the hemorrhage, this blood will ooze out from the liver and it will collect in the near the peritoneum. What will happen? There will be a fever, a slight fever. So it will happen in the, and in some tuberculosis conditions, if there is collection of pus in the body, definitely there will be elevated temperature. So an infection, inflammation, infestation, and collection can cause fever. See, in all these conditions, the first thing the patient is going to tell you is that I feel very uneasy. The second thing is the patient is mostly the patient will lose his appetite. The patient is reluctant to take food. Something like symptoms of AMA will emerge. So a fever and AMA is something like, of course, they are fever is of course the symptom of an AMA. Definitely in all these conditions, infection is causing an AMA because infection is acting through an inflammation. Inflammation is causing fever because it facilitates collection of something. A collection itself is causing this, because ultimately AMA is also a collection or a non-mobility of RESA. So if you think about in these fever conditions, in infections conditions and inflammation conditions, you can look into ESR, you can look into CRP levels. Definitely, it in some way may predict the presence of AMA. But be very careful when you are approaching it therapeutically, because it may aid in there is an AMA, the status of AMA, and the clinical stage of the patient. Everything will give you by the ESR. But when you approach the patient with a therapeutic purpose, you have to stick on to Ayurvedic principles. You assess the person with the Ayurvedic principles and you treat. It may not in the beginning of your practice, it may not give you a clear-cut idea which medicine to use. By simply looking into the ESR, you cannot predict that Amrutotram Kashayam is better, Drakshadi Kashayam is better. In order to select Amrutotram Kashayam and Drakshadi Kashayam, you have to rely on the clinical symptomatology of the patient also. So the clinical symptomatology and signs and symptoms are much more important than these diagnostic tools to select Ayurvedic treatment, Ayurvedic for a proper therapeutic approach. But to predict the prognosis and to get an aid in the diagnosis, you definitely these laboratory investigations will definitely help you, I think. Thank you.
Okay, sir. So can we move on to the next question, sir?
Yeah, please.
During this corona period, we have getting D dimer values
Yeah. Okay.
different in different pathology labs, sir.
I missed you in between.
So during this corona period, we are getting D dimer values different in different pathology labs in a single day period. What may be the reason for that, sir?
Actually, majority of the laboratory. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible, sir.
Yeah. Majority of the D dimer is comparatively a newer inclusion of the inclusion into the whole laboratory test. Uh, the things we really need to know is two typical terminologies that we usually use to determine the accuracy of a test. It is sensitivity and specificity. Okay, sensitivity and specificity depends upon lot of factors. The person who are conducting the test, the test kit, the accuracy of the test kit they are using, and just talk about two tests: the RT-PCR and this rapid antigen test. Both tests we are using for COVID, right? Okay. RT-PCR is a highly sensitive and specific test because why? Because it is specifically identify the viral RNA. Okay, and it amplifies the viral RNA, and we are getting the test positive result. The problem with this test is that, and a positive RT-PCR test never means that the person is infective or person is actually having an active disease, because even if the person is not in an active stage of COVID disease, the person may have might have a COVID disease, and after 10 days when we test in an RT-PCR, still even though he is not having an active disease, the RT-PCR will show a positive result in majority of the patients. Why? Because even though the virus is not active, virus is not infective, the viral shedding is happening because the body immune system has already won the match, and the virus is shedding through the fecal matter or shedding through the urine. But still, the RT-PCR can amplify the inactive viral DNA and it will show a test positive. What is the problem with the RAT test? RAT test is a rapid antigen test. We are taking the swab and we have an antibody with us, and we are looking into the antigen. Only if there is an active virus in the nose, we will get this test positive. Okay, but it never means that if the test is negative, it never means that the person is not having the disease. That is a problem with the RAT test, because it is highly sensitive, but it is unable to give you if a RAT test negative never means that the person is free from COVID. That is the difference between these two tests. Even though both the tests we are using, the sensitivity and specificity of both these tests are different. Likewise, the D dimer test also, depending upon the person conducting this disease, it is the test kit is and of course different set of methods might be using to detect this D dimer test, and the interval between conducting these two tests again may cause different set of values. Okay, if you are saying that a D dimer test conducted in a laboratory is different from the D dimer test conducted in the laboratory B, that means you have to take the blood at a single point of time and you divide it and give to two laboratory, and if at that time these two values differs, then only we can say that there is actually a difference. Okay, so these are the factors usually affects not only D dimer but also in usual common blood test. So even if you look into ESR, this may happen while we are testing ESR in one laboratory, and after a couple of days we are looking into another laboratory. It may vary. So it happens in laboratory tests. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for answering all the questions with so much patience between your schedule and sharing for your valuable time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. Now I would like to welcome Dr. E.R. Surabhi, Assistant Professor, Department of Rachana Sharira, Ayurveda College, Coimbatore, to deliver the vote of thanks.
A warm good
Over to
evening
you,
to
ma'am.
all. Yeah, a warm good evening to all. It's a privilege and great joy for me to extend a vote of thanks on this occasion. First and foremost, I would like to express gratitude and sincere thanks to Dr. Rajmohan sir for giving an excellent coverage to the much wider area of blood investigations and its importance. We all have been fortunate enough to have one of the most eminent personalities from Ayurveda with us here. Your knowledge, depth of understanding, and interpretation comes through in your teaching session evidently and seems to be a part of what makes you an effective speaker. Your session helped us all of us by giving a closer look into the blood investigation area, which is very mandatory for every physician in his clinical practice. My wholehearted thanks to you, sir, for going above and beyond. May the wisdom and well health go along. Thank you so much, sir. In behalf of Ayurveda College Coimbatore family and Diksha e-learning, I extend my thanks to all guests and participants here. Thank you all for being with us this evening. It's been a great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Shall I leave? Thank you.
We have come to the end of the session. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Dear delegates, our next Diksha Free webinar series will be conducted on 30th January. In the next session, we will be discussing about importance of Panchakarma in Sandhi Vikaras by Dr. Charu Supriya, Assistant Professor, Department of Panchakarma, Rajiv Gandhi Ayurveda College, Himachal Pradesh. Thank you everyone for joining with us today. For further details on our upcoming session, stay connected with us in all our social media. Hope you all had a great evening. Thank you everyone.